Hi, Carrie the Catalyst here, and I'm making another video about the importance of communication and writing and reading and how much it can make an impact in people. I don't yet have permission, but I'm pretty sure I won't get in trouble if I read from a book, since I'm giving Lois Lowry, author of The Giver, all the credit for this. But as well as reading the story, because I want the students in the Teen Writer Bootcamp to understand the significance of reading as well as writing, I wanted to share the introduction with you. Now, this woman is pretty famous and an excellent writer. So, in her introduction to The Giver, she said, 20 years? No kidding. 20 years? It's hard to believe. 20 years ago, I was much younger. My parents were still alive. 2 of my grandchildren had not yet been born. And another one, now at college, was an infant. 20 years ago, I didn't own a cell phone. I didn't know what quinoa was, and I doubt I had ever tasted kale. There had recently been a war. We now refer to it, that one, as the first Gulf War. But back then, mercifully, we didn't know there would be another. Maybe a lot of us weren't even thinking about the future then, but I was, and I'm a writer. I wrote The Giver on a big machine that had recently taken the place of my much beloved typewriter. And after I printed the pages, very noisily, I had to tear them apart one by one at the perforated edges. When I referred to it as my computer, someone more knowledgeable pointed out that my machine was not a computer. It was a dedicated word processor. Oh, okay then, I said, as if I understood the difference. As I carefully separated those 200 or so pages, I glanced again at the words I had typed on them. I could see that I had written a complete book. It had all the elements of the 17 or so books I had written before. The same things students of writing list on school quizzes: characters, plot, setting, tension, climax. Though I didn't reply as he had hoped to a student who emailed me some years later with the request, please list all the similes and metaphors in The Giver. I'm sure it contained those as well. I had typed the end after intentionally ambiguous final paragraphs. So there's a tip there, intentionally ambiguous. But I was aware that this book was different from many I had written before. My editor, when I gave him the manuscript, realized the same thing. If I had drawn a cartoon of him reading those pages, it would have had a text balloon over his head. The text would have simply said, gulp. But nothing prepared me for readers' reactions. And this is the reason I'm reading it to you. I had always received lots of letters from kids, frequently writing a class assignment. One began, "This is a friendly letter." Over the years, of course, there have been more often become emails, but they didn't compare to the mail about The Giver. First of all, the volume, the sheer number of them. Even now, 20 years later, they still come, sometimes 50 to 60 in a day. But now the letter writers were different. Sure, some of them were still kids, but a startling number were much older, and the content was no longer the school assignment letter, the obligatory, "I thought this was a pretty good book." Instead, the letters were passionate. "Jesus would be ashamed of you," one woman wrote, and sometimes startlingly personal. One couple wrote to me about their autistic, selectively mute teenager who had recently spoke to them for the very first time about The Giver, urging them to read it. A teacher from South Carolina wrote that the most disruptive, difficult student in her 8th grade class had called her at home on a no-school day and begged her to read him the next chapter over the phone. A night watchman in an oil refinery wrote that he had happened upon the book. It was lying on someone else's desk when making his rounds. "I'm not a reader," he wrote, "but man, I'm glad I came to work tonight." A Trappist monk wrote to me and said he considered the book a sacred text. A man who had, as an adult, fled the cult in which he had been raised told me that his psychiatrist had recommended The Giver to him. Countless new parents have written to explain why their babies have been named Gabriel. A teacher in rural China sent me a photograph of beaming students holding up their copies of the book. The FBI took an interest in the 200-page, vaguely threatening letter sent by a man who insisted that he was actually the giver and advised me not to go to the city where he lived. A teenage girl wrote that she had been considering suicide until she read The Giver. One young man wrote a personal proposal of marriage to his girlfriend inside the book and gave it to her. She said yes. But a woman told me in a letter that I was clearly a disturbed person and hoped I would get some help. Somehow, this book and what it has to say has touched a lot of people from all walks of life and from many cultures, since over the years it has been translated into countless languages, from Czech to Hungarian to Thai. Recently, I reluctantly turned down invitations to speak about The Giver in Kazakhstan and Korea, where I am told readers are just as affected by it as they are in Toledo and Tucson. A stage adaptation of The Giver has been performed in cities and towns across the USA for years. More recently, an opera has been composed and performed, and soon there will be a film. At the time of making this video, that film has been out for quite a while. Does The Giver have the same effect when it is presented in a different way? It's hard to know. A book to me is almost always sacrosanct, such an individual and private thing. The reader brings his or her own history and beliefs and concerns and reads in solitude, creating each scene from his own imagination as he does. There is no fellow ticket holder in the next seat. The important thing is that another medium, stage, film, music, doesn't obliterate a book. The movie is here now, on a big screen, with stars and costumes and a score. But the book hasn't gone away. It's simply grown up, grown larger, and began to glisten in a new way. Okay, I said all that to tell you that as a writer, you will have people that love your ideas and hate your ideas, and they will be extremely vocal about it. But now I want to start reading the first chapter. So if you're willing, let's dive into chapter 1. Thank you.